Asia News.
Britain suffered its worst ever military defeat when in February 1942 Singapore capitulated. The Japanese found they had over 100,000 Allied prisoners of war to organise. They set up a makeshift camp close to the Singapore jail in a village called Changi. And it was to Changi and an uncertain future that the prisoners were marched.
We didn't know what was going to happen. All we knew was that we were prisoners of war. And, I mean, we didn't know the attitude of the Japanese towards us. We didn't know if they actually had signed the Geneva Convention on prisoners of war, which they hadn't apparently. So our life was in their hands.
It was all under control of British officers. It was there was a lot of blokes walking around with boards under their arms, you know, and brassards on their arms. I think that that was the easy part, Changi.
And when I was at Changi, we used to see trucks of Chinese roped together, brought up to Changi, and machine gunned into the sea. They were doing it there, just off Changi, and another point off Sentosa Island in the south, and somewhere off the docks. I think they were doing the same thing. And in 6 weeks, they simply exterminated, for no reason at all, something like 15,000 Chinese.
Jack Chalker had been a student of fine art. Now he decided to sketch the horrors he witnessed.
I remember on one occasion where somebody had stolen directly from the Japanese, and they tied his hands to a stump of tree and beat them to pulp with a lump hammer. So we knew very well that any breach of discipline was going to be met with pretty considerable savagery.
The drawings and primitive sketches he made, at great risk to himself, remain the most detailed visual record of the sufferings experienced by the prisoners of war.
We left Singapore by train. 30 men to a metal box truck with all their equipment.
It was immensely crowded and immensely hot, as you can imagine, in those things, in tropical heat. And the journey to Thailand took 5 days and 5 nights. Dysentery and malaria were already rife. And so we didn't smell very nice. I mean, the people who were literally almost incontinent in those trucks. And from time to time, the truck's doors were closed, so it was pretty ghastly.
We were told before we left Singapore we were going to a better place, better camp, better food.
In fact, the prisoners were going north to become part of a huge slave labour force. They would live and die building a railway across the huge limestone hills and river valleys of southwest Thailand and Burma, so that the Japanese could supply their western front lines in safety.
And then we were dumped out into a filthy, disgusting, rotting camp in this place called Bampong. And it was the tail end of the monsoon.
Bloody horrible place it was. It was a wet season, flooded. All the huts, water was very high up.
It stunk to high heaven, and it was full of people who were already quite grievously ill. We had rice in baskets that were alive with weevils and maggots. We were virtually starving again. The next day, we had a 5-day march up country to the working camps on the railway trace. People were beginning to be not only exhausted through lack of food, but also beginning to be increasingly ill because malaria was breaking out more frequently. And when you're very sick and it's tropical heat, it's hard going. This was typical of how we looked, really, when people arrived up country, ready to work on the railway trace. And they were in pretty poor shape to start with, let alone what happened afterwards. Our first working camp was Kenya Camp, a river camp, on this extremely beautiful part of the Kwainoi River.
It was just a hut, in fact, by the side of the river with a few Japanese in it. So the first job we had to do was to cut the bamboo down, cut the jungle, clear it up to make the first camp, Kanyu River Camp, which we did. And within days from that, they were sending working parties up the hill to where the trace for the railway was to be.
They had to have a road alongside it to facilitate the construction. We did that because it was all in fairly tough sort of jungle. And then eventually we started the construction of the actual embankments, 1 metre a day per man.
And we used to work from early hours in the morning until dusk, and you were slugging away on the railway up embankment, either carrying earth up to make an embankment higher or cutting out to make it down level. Then you stop for about an hour to have a lunch, such as it was, cold rice and what have you. Very little meat, and then you march back to camp. Another rice meal and then to bed, and that was it. Nothing else to do until the dawn the following day. You went back to work again, 7 days a week.
From Kanchanabra southwards was flat country, and that was easy to put the railway through. But once you got into these north-south running 3,000 to 5,000 foot ridges covered in thick subtropical rainforest, it was a very different matter altogether, and this is where all the difficulties really occurred. Bamboo grows to about 80 foot high there. It's huge, with an enormous section to it. And it's wonderful material because it'll float, or you could weave it, you could make boxes of it. It's the most adaptable material. But the bamboo growing up there had huge spikes on it, 3 or 4 inch hard spikes. And clearing these enormous clumps, which might be sort of anything to about 10 or 12 metres across, when this stuff came down, it used to tear people about. You would get terrible scratches and things. And because people were extremely emaciated and starving, your resistance was very poor towards infection, and so you could get a scratch or an injury to your leg, and within about 2 or 3 days you'd have a hole the size of half a crown, and it'd be half an inch deep and suppurating. We had no medical supplies at all, so there was no antiseptic material to use. And then the flies came and laid maggots in it, and it resulted in these terrifying ulcers where the limbs literally began to rot away.
Chalker began to sketch the medical problems he saw, the beginning of a huge body of work as a medical artist, and evidence for later generations.
A lot of people continued to work on the railway with ulcers because the Japanese decided that every day there should be a certain percentage, a quota of people working. And they would override any medical officer's decision about the men who were sick, and people were taken out of the sick huts and taken up onto the working trace and made to work regardless.
We used to have to work really hard. And of course the engineers, who were the people in charge when you were working, were Japanese, and they knew how to drive you. Drove you with a stick. They'd hit you with anything.
If you were not working hard enough, in the Japanese opinion, they would make you hold a stone above your head, and of course once you put your arms up above your head you feel rather faint anyway, and try and hold the stone up there was extremely difficult. And if you dropped it, it gave them excuse to beat you up, and if you fainted it gave you even more excuse to sort of kick you around on the ground. But this was a kind of habitual thing, with holding the stone up there if you were not working hard enough.
I think a lot of men out there gave up. He said, "Oh, sod this, I can't stick this," and that was it. And you buried them.
We started burying people from the time we set up camp in Kanyu. The first death we had was of a young man just after his 21st birthday, and then a lot of people died of diphtheria, quite apart from dysentery, malaria and all the other things. The illogicality comes when you think that if they had fed people better and looked after them better, they would have had far less trouble than they did with sending an enormous number of prisoners up there who were sick and starving. But that had no effect on them whatever. We were simply expendable and it didn't really matter.
After just a few months, the punishing schedule was destroying the health and morale of the POWs. But it was to get even worse, as the Japanese guards increased the intense workload during the infamous Speedo period of railway building. "60,000 prisoners of war were put to work as slave labourers on the railway. So many fell seriously ill so quickly, and so many died, that the Japanese organised the dying into sick camps. One of the first was here, at Chunkai.
After being in the railway camp at Kanyu, I had quite a lot of malaria and dysentery and dengue fever, and then I was sent down sick to Chunkai, which was the first of the sick camps.
There were very, very long huts built in 3 sections, and there must have been dozens and dozens of them, because I think there was about 6,000 or 7,000 in the camp then. 20 months later, there was 12,000 in the camp. So it was growing all the time.
I was in charge of 2 wards of each of about 300 people, 1 surgical and 1 dysentery. But the morale was quite high from most of these people who'd been up country where, well, it's indescribable. But coming back to the base camp and really being nursed in a way, I mean, the medical orderlies that there were did a wonderful job. When you think of emptying perhaps 20 or 30 or 40 bedpans a day from dysentery patients.
One of the things that was so precious, I think, the whole time was humour. When you have dysentery and you're almost incontinent, well, very often completely incontinent, you go an enormous number of times. And they were running sweepstake as to who would get the highest score at the end of the day, which might be anything up to about 35, 40 times. I mean, that's a lot in 24 hours. But what was funny about it was that everybody was watching everybody else to see they didn't cheat. and so there was this kind of this funny thing going on, which was so important in all this.
Often humour was the only weapon they had to fight diseases that spread through the camps.
Cholera broke out every year. It was an annual event. When a patient gets cholera, the body becomes extremely dehydrated. And even with the very thin patients like that, within 24 hours they could almost change. You could hardly recognise some of them. The only relief for this was giving intravenous saline, and stills were made, primitive stills were made in the camp to make distilled water and a saline solution, which could then be intravenously put into the patient, which relieved these appalling cramps through dehydration. For me, it's one of the most terrifying of diseases that I've ever witnessed, because the rapidity with which this disease comes on and the change in people within 24 hours is remarkable.
A lot of them had given up. One lad died in the night, and 3 times I brought him back, and then I thought, well, you don't want to come back. Let him go then.
In the meantime, my own regiment was at Canyu too. They used to start these jungle camps and then they'd move both directions till they met the people from the camp below and above. And just above us was the Australian camp of Hintok, where they were digging this great cutting. It was hammer and tap, which meant that one poor chap held the metal bar, whilst the other poor chap swung a 7-pound hammer, and of course occasionally missed. But I understand it got to the stage in the end that some people weren't all that sorry when he missed, because it lost their hands. They got taken off for a while.
This was something like about 40 metres deep and probably anything up to 110, 115 metres long. These were enormous cuttings, largely made with iron drills and 8-pound hammers, and a certain amount of blasting that went on, very often quite arbitrary on the part of the Japanese, who would set a charge, light the fuse and walk away, and then a number of people were continuously being injured by this sort of haphazard, sadistic attitude to the whole thing. But making these cuttings was an appalling labour, and there were so many particular cuttings in this area that the work became slightly behind schedule. So there was an enormous speedo period, as the Japanese called it, between about March 1943 and August 1943, when the railway was linked up. In order to meet the scheduled time, the Japanese organised groups of people to work day and night. And this is where an enormous number of injuries, very considerable illness and distress was caused, and perhaps was one of the most horrific bits, if you like, of the whole of this railway right through to Burma. Largely, I think, because of the nature of the country, just in this particular area, they had to make a huge double loop on the hillsides, and enormous ramps to hold the railway embankment up. And it was just immense, almost impossibilities going on there.
In one of these jobs, one of these charming bamboo spikes must have cut the leg, and it made a sore, and the sore just didn't disappear. It just gets bigger, and then it's turned septic. And you're still working every day, you've got to realise, so you can't go on and say, I want time off to do all this, that and the other. It went on getting worse because it was made worse by the fact that I tended to keep having dysentery and malaria, and each time I got an attack of malaria, it made the leg get worse.
As the ulcers got really bad, then they were sent down eventually to Chung Kai, and they flooded down there by the hundreds. There were huts full of these people with these most terrifying ulcers, with very often the legs simply rotting away. And sort of emergency toilets had to be done on the men. We used an ordinary tablespoon, perhaps with Spencer Wells as well, just scraping out the pus and muck and pulling out rotting bone and chasing the maggots out of these huge channels up into the limbs. After I'd been there a little time, sick, I was getting better, I worked with Markovich, a superb surgeon. He was a rather brilliant man. He decided the only way we could try and save some of the lives was to amputate some of these rotting limbs.
It just got larger and larger, and I was getting weaker and weaker, and this is sepsis, which has to be cleaned up all the time. And they decided that the only hope I had of surviving was of having the leg off.
This was the beginning, really, of the ingenious manufacture of all sorts of surgical instruments, such as retractors and rib cutters made out of bits of wire and bits of metal.
The instruments were prepared by boiling them, and then they were taken out with forceps. They were laid out for the operation as best they could, but there was very little that one could do.
Anesthesia was a hell of a problem. There was hardly any general anaesthesia. So for amputation, they used spinal analgesia using Novocaine injected into your lumbar spine, which then anaesthetised the patient really from the umbilicus down. So the patients were entirely conscious during the operation.
But he virtually had a butcher's knife, which severed it just above the knee, and he used an ordinary butcher's saw to saw the bone through. Jung Kai was the first place that did side-by-side blood transfusion. They did it by putting spoons and stirring in, and out of every pint of blood they took out, they got fibrin about the size of an egg. And they were able to then transfer straight from one arm into the X by bamboo needles and rubber tubing.
When you came round afterwards, instead of screaming, "Oh dear, they've taken my leg off, look at me now, I'm a cripple," no, not at all. You just thank God that terrible pain was easing.
Ingenuity and teamwork saved thousands of lives. Men used everything they could scrounge, invent or steal in a constant struggle against death and disease. And they were fantastically successful.
You can put a geneticist and a pharmacist together and a tinsmith and all sorts of people, and you can begin to make apparatus really virtually from scratch. And this is what was so extremely interesting. If you put a collection of people with every kind of capability together, and you can move half the mountain.
The railway was finally completed in October 1943, but the survivors' hell was to last another 18 months. Liberation did not come until August 1945. Now the awful legacy of the political and military failures in Singapore became clear. More than 12,000 Allied servicemen had died, and many of the POWs had suffered physical and mental scars. There had been the finest of lines between survival and death.
I've seen tough, really tough blokes just pack up like that and lose the will to live. That's the key to it. I think I've been very close to it, though, close to the dropping off the peg, as it were, or off the bow. I think I had.
Survival depends a lot on laughter and your friends all the time. I mean, we depended on each other throughout those difficult times, and I'm very grateful for that, and the people that helped one through, and the people with whom one could laugh and share experiences. And I would not have missed it now, but I was lucky.